Hey, hi. Welcome to the second episode of Patthar Ke Fools. The first episode, whose video you can see in my and Floyd's profile page, as well as on YouTube, where there's a more detailed video with lots of visuals and text overlays integrated. Today's episode is actually going to be about sugar. Right? So, for those wondering what's on my shirt, people who don't understand Tamil, it means no, I don't understand. So it's sort of said in a very ironic fashion, a dialogue from a Tamil film and so on, but that's what it actually means. So, all right, so welcome everyone. This is Patthar Ke Fools episode 2. And this one's about sugar, right? This series is called Patthar Ke Fools because stone flour, dagad fool, kalpasi, is a spice that's common in Maharashtrian and Tamil cooking. And it is a lichin. It's a very rare lichin that has a very interesting smoky flavor. So if you've never used it, you should use it. If you are from Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra, you've probably used it, either as part of Goda masala or when you're making chettinad food anyway, right? So that is Patthar Ke Fools. And on that, which by itself, as you might imagine, is a cringy pun. On that note, today's topic is sugar. We're going to go on this sort of random and complete tour around the world of history and science and completely absurd stories about sugar. The history of sugar is anything but sweet. It's not even bittersweet. It's just downright bitter. And to balance out all the darkness of the history of sugar, we will obviously throw in needlessly cringy jokes. So again, I'll start by saying that sugar is the sweetness is one of the most elemental tastes. It's one of the things that anybody who's held a small baby and given it a piece of sugar knows that it really just wakes our mind up. It tells our brains that, oh, what you're eating is high calorie. You better eat a lot of it because, I don't know when you're going to get it next. Our eyes just light up and the brain lights up and then it says, yeah, get more, give me more. It makes you salivate. And it's one of this, and particularly the flavor of sugar, meaning particularly sucrose, from sugarcane and so on, is one of the most cleanest experiences of sweetness. Is that it's that intense, and then it disappears without an aftertaste, right? Something that actually makes a lot of sugar substitutes so hard to really design because all of them have an aftertaste. Whereas it's only sucrose that has absolutely, no aftertaste. On that sort of sweet beginning to sugar, over to you, Pranav.
So I'll just, again, as you said, there is nothing sweet about the history of sugar, but I would like to go back to how sugar came to be and stuff. So basically sugarcane itself was first domesticated from the wild by, contrary to popular belief, not Indians. It was first domesticated by New Guineans or Papuans, as we can call them.
Yeah. Yes. Of the famous cannibal habit Spain. Yes.
So they also domesticated bananas and yams. So sugarcane for them was a treat. It wasn't a main thing of subsistence. It wasn't a part of their daily diet. It was just something they would eat to celebrate, which is what sugar is to most of us now. But sugarcane was back in those days, but I'm talking about 4000 BC or 5000 BC. Back in those times, sugarcane was actually, the exterior of sugarcane was pretty tough. It was like bamboo almost. Chewing through it was not a concept that was known to humans, maybe pandas, but definitely not humans.
Yes. Sort of irony being that in those days, first you break your teeth by trying to bite into bamboo strength sugarcane. And then afterwards, all the sugar in your teeth will bring bacteria to cause cavities to further damage your teeth. So a double whammy.
Never a concept that you could bite into sugarcane, but it was selectively bred over generations to make it such that it could easily be chewed through. And then eventually it found its way to India and China, mainly the southern China region. In fact, the word sugar itself comes from Sanskrit word, which is sharkara. Again, there are conflicting stories, and you can never believe in food stories because who knows, right? They also say
it's
that
very hard, yes. And plus, also the rather legendary Indian habit of
never writing anything down,
never
never
writing
documenting anything. Koi aur kar lega.
Yes.
So they also say that the Chinese came up with the term shache, which then kind of corrupted down to sharkara, which then became the Arabic traders then got the sharkara from India and made it al-shakkar. And that al-shakkar, when the Muslims and the Arabic traders went to Spain, they made it azúcar, so which is still the word for sugar in Spanish. And that became sucre. Azúcar became sucre in French and Old English, and then from sucre it became sugar. So a bunch of traveling happened, and kind of like the etymology of the word itself tells us of the history of sugar and how it traveled.
The interesting thing is that a rather bizarre thing is that the Malayalam word, the older Malayalam word for jaggery, shakkara, and then the Portuguese then made it jagara, and then became jaggery. So both sugar and jaggery both come from Sanskrit.
And that's not where it stops. So basically, ancient Indians kind of they honed the skill of using the sugarcane juice and reducing it down to make like the impure form of sugar, which is jaggery. They in fact went a step further, and impure form of sugar was crystallized through more refining, and this big refined sugar was then taken again by the Arab traders to North Africa and stuff, mainly to Egypt especially, and people in Egypt went like batshit crazy over this like new crystallized sugar substance, and they basically started producing and making and exporting this newly made crystalline sugar in huge quantities from Egypt. And funnily enough, the Arabs called Egypt Misr.
Wait, so the Egyptians called themselves Masr Misr, actually. So it is indeed. Yeah, so Egypt is actually the anglicized name of it. So the Egyptians themselves do call themselves Al-Masr or Al-Misr.
And that's where we get the term Misri from. So Misri that we use for like rock sugar.
Misri,
that comes from, so basically the sugar went from here to Egypt, and then Egypt made it their own, and they started like sending it across in like huge quantities, and thus Misr, sugar belonging from Misra became Misri, and we got Misri. Indians actually took this Misri form a step further and purified it even further and made the white sugar that we now consume. Obviously not as purified as we eat it today, but white nonetheless. And a heap of that white sugar almost appeared like porcelain to them. So it looked like chini mitti, which is what porcelain was called back in the day. And that's why in Hindi we call
China. Porcelain. So literally in English, when people say Chinaware, China is usually refers to.
So the heap of sugar looked like porcelain, which is why they started calling it chini in Hindi, because it looked like chini mitti or porcelain. That's again not where it stops. It's crazy. Like I get so excited when I see multiple words connecting together to form like so many commonly used words that we know today. It goes a step further, because the Chinese, they used to eat sugar as a treat, right? Like they would eat sugar drops as a treat. And they called this kan di. So those were the two syllables that they used, which meant sugar drop, kandi. And kandi then went on to become khanda in Sanskrit, and kand in Arabic,
Sanskrit,
then became candy in English. So candy is also derived from like a Sanskrit base.
Also from this part of the world.
So
it's also interesting how how I think sometimes people forget that archaeologists and archaeology is not merely just about digging stuff. It's just that archaeology per se is about digging stuff and inferring the history based on objects and things that you find under the soil. But a good part of history is also trying to understand the arc of history through language changes, because language changes can sometimes continue on, right? Meaning that, a people in a specific place use a certain word. And then you can track how that word travels across, and then you can make out migration patterns, trade patterns, and so on. And so it sort of reminded me of a slight tangential this thing, although not related to sugar, but again, quite fascinating nonetheless, which is that, famously, or rather infamously, we've not managed to decipher the script of the Indus Valley folks, right? And it's a lot of the political history of the subcontinent is dependent on what we find out about the Indus Valley people actually, right? So there is this sort of, although there is now population genetic evidence that's pointing in one direction and so on, an interesting linguistic evidence for what might have been the kind of language that the people in the Indus Valley spoke actually comes from one of these interesting observations that was made by this Finnish guy who worked on this, right? Which is that it is known that sesame was originally grown in that part of the world, and that's how sesame oil or till oil is such a crucial element of Indian cooking and so on. One of the earliest seeds, one of the earliest plant sources of fat, actually, right? So what ended up happening is that the belief is that because the Indus Valley seeds and coins were found in Sumeria, right? The idea is that they traded with the Mesopotamians, right? And since it is not, the sesame is not native to that place, the general idea also, we know that things tend to retain the names of where they originally came from, because the local place may not have a name for it. Right, and the Sumerian word for sesame is Ellu. Okay, and that's interesting. Ellu, E-L-L-U, right? So, which is interesting because that is the Tamil word for sesame. Right. So what part of the idea that they have spoken a Proto-Dravidian language comes from one of the things that evidence. It's not obviously finalized yet. It's the fact that they actually used the Tamil word for what is. Right, and by the way, so interestingly enough, they also refer to the people from the Indus Valley as Meluhas. So obviously,
Immortals of Meluha,
series of books about Immortals of Meluha and all of that. So that is also another sort of thing that points. But unrelated, but I think it's quite interesting how sugar, particularly, right? The words for sugar have just traveled all over, right? And between and somebody was asking where chini came from. Yeah, so literally came from the fact that it looked like porcelain, right? Right. So the other interesting thing I've always wanted to, since we spoke about sugar and jaggery sort of interchangeably and so on, and again, rather famously, people do believe that these are very separate things, and one is somehow natural, pure, unprocessed, and the other one is like just pure chemicals on steroids and so on. So it's actually quite. If you actually go to a sugar factory, or if you go to a place where jaggery is made, first thing you'll notice is that a sugar factory is like there's actually far
first thing
more
you notice is like they smell horrible, by the way.
That they do. That's because it's going to ferment, right? That much sugar, well, it's going to ferment. It'll smell like rum, right? When in a pleasant sense, but like really bad rum, right? And so on. So the interesting thing is that, one is that in a sugar factory, human hands aren't involved at all, right? A jaggery is a lot of hands involved. Okay? It's done in a very, very basic manner. So process is actually very simple. You got to squeeze the sugarcane juice out of the sugarcane, right? You've got to filter it, right? Because the juice will have a lot of solid particles, which are not sugar, fiber and all of that. You've got to filter all of that. So after you filter, you've got to go through a series of processes to cleanse it of even more dissolved particles, right? And so the first step is actually adding lime, right? So lime actually clarifies the really cloudy sort of liquid sugar into something that's not quite white yet. It's still yellowish brown and all of that. But calcium hydroxide, lime, tuna is actually a very important first step, right? So that's the first chemical that is used, if you will, right? And then they actually pass carbon dioxide gas through the sugar, right? So any calcium hydroxide that got left behind, because lime doesn't necessarily taste great, so that's going to precipitate as calcium carbonate, which you can then filter out. Right? Yeah, because calcium carbonate will show up, right? We've all done these
school experiments,
things in the lab, right? So once you have calcium hydroxide, you add something, calcium carbonate becomes a precipitate and all of that. So you all remember that. It's the same thing, right? And then comes the third step is the controversial one, which is that they pass sulfur dioxide gas to remove any last traces of lime. And you can choose to do as little of it as possible or not at all if necessary, and leave a little bit of the lime and the sugar. That's fine. So these are the only chemicals that are used in the sugar making process. And people think this is what is making it white. It is not. All these are actually doing is removing impurities. And then what makes it white is that now once you have this liquid, you're going to do something called centrifuge, right? So you're going to put it in a centrifuge, And that will separate the molasses from the actual sugar, which will crystallize, right? The sugar crystals themselves are white. It's the molasses part that is actually the brown bits, right? And then they put a little bit of steam that washes all of the molasses out. You get like white sugar. If you don't use steam, you get brown sugar.
In fact,
that's really all there is to it.
The sugar crystals aren't even white. Like they are just transparent, and collectively they give us the illusion that they are white.
Yes. They just appear, because all of that, all the reflection and all of that stuff makes it, So, interestingly enough, jaggery, only thing is that you boil the sugarcane juice, it has to go through a similar clarification process. Now, the only difference is in a factory, in a sugar factory, it's all controlled. You have these different canisters, you put a measured amount of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, calcium hydroxide, and so on. Here, some guy will take one sack full of chemicals and drop it, okay? And people will just sort of stir it and remove the scum that's sort of floating to the top. So they use sodium dithionite, which is called hydrose, right? And they use a ton of other, by the way, they use lime, right? And they use this sodium dithionite. For all the stuff about sulfur-free, sodium dithionite is very much a sulfurous salt. So, and then by the way, and none of this is actually washed out or filtered out, right? So it just, all of that stuff is just going into your this thing. So that's how you get the lighter brown. Otherwise, it's like dark brown
and correct
which
me,
nobody wants to buy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but like since last episode was about salt, like sendha namak, doesn't sendha namak have like sulfuric impurities in it, which is why it tastes the way it does? But black salt.
Rock salt, yeah. So your black salt, kala namak particularly. Yeah, kala namak actually has volcanic black salt, actually has sodium sulfide, right? And a small amount of hydrogen sulfide. So which smells it smells of rotten.
But funnily enough,
it smells of eggs actually.
Sulfur is okay and even healthy and like considered like great for your health and stuff.
Yes.
But sulfur and sugar, oh no, that's
Yes. So hydrogen sulfide is not a healthy gas by any imagination. It is quite a noxious gas. But in tiny amounts, it smells like eggs, and people are okay with it in chaat masala, right? But sugar that is legally required to be 99.5% sucrose, right? If at all you have any sulfur left out, it's going to be in the
that is chemicals.
That is chemicals. So yes.
Someone was just asking that sugar is acidic, but why are root vegetables like carrots and stuff sweeter, like so sweet? There's actually a very interesting answer for that. So basically, it's all to do with like nature just being like a beautiful magician of sorts.
Okay. So let me carry on that. Accidental magician, because it's just you try many things and then the few things that appear magical end up surviving.
Right.
So to use the evolutionary correct yes.
Basically, this you'll also notice that vegetables, especially root vegetables, taste much more sweeter in winter. Specifically, that's why you wait for the winters to like harvest your Delhi carrots, as they call it, to make your gajar halwa. Because carrots taste a lot sweeter in winter, and there's a simple explanation for that, which is that like freezing in general is terrible for plants, much like any living being, because if like ice crystals form inside the cell, it can rupture the cell and everything. So basically, when cold weather hits, what some plants do is it's a very ingenious way they secrete enzymes that break down some of the starch that is there in plant cells into simple sugars. So starch in itself is a bit of a complex sugar.
It's just glucose molecules in a big
chain structure. And they break it down into simple sugars. And what happens is this simple sugar, basically, it dissolves with the water inside the cells. And when sugar dissolves, like you can do this as a common experiment, like you dissolve sugar in water, the freezing point for that solution will be far lower than your normal freezing point.
Lower.
Happens with salt.
It happens with salt also, right? So that's why they dump it in
from icing, or even like in ice cream rollers and stuff. They'll dump it on the ice. So basically, this simple sugar that dissolves with the water in the cell, it lowers the freezing point for the cell, and it keeps the vegetables from freezing in the cold. A useful benefit of that for us is that the vegetables, especially root vegetables, which are much closer to the ground and more at risk of freezing, they tend to become sweeter for us, and that's why your Delhi carrots for gajar halwas are sweeter in winter, or any of the root vegetables are much sweeter in winter because of these simple sugars.
And also grains grown in winter, like wheat and all that, tend to have more protein. So actually, they spend less on growing taller, and so the cellulose spend is less. So a lot of that energy gets spent in making proteins into the seed, and so therefore that's why your winter wheat is generally higher protein, and sometimes so high that it is actually unsuitable for making bread. So they use it to make pasta. So durum wheat, which is sort of like a winter wheat, is used to make pasta. So the person who's asked the question about root vegetables, so how are these vegetables alkaline? So this I think is a very common misconception, right? When something is alkaline in the context of food, it's not like really alkaline. Is that because all of food is largely acidic, right? At max neutral, the most alkaline thing you can find is like egg whites. Right. That's really just about it, and that was just only marginally above 7, and not so because very alkaline stuff actually very nasty. So we don't like it at all, right? So everything you eat, and sugar is really not that acidic, like say actual tartaric acid and things that you find in say fruits. The other things that make sourness, right? So sugar is not like really that acidic. Jaggery is slightly more acidic because of all the other plant acids that leaked out of those cells and that got mixed up with the brown goo. Other than that, which by the way they use a base to neutralize all of that acids. Otherwise, jaggery will be like slightly more acidic than it otherwise would be, and so on, right? So the point is that these vegetables are not alkaline at all. Okay, they're either largely neutral. They are obviously relatively more alkaline than say fruits, which are definitely acidic. But they're not really alkaline. So that's really
someone was asking what if we just give up sugar for the entirety of our life?
Fine. You really can't.
Everything you eat will have some form of sugar in the form of glucose or fructose.
Every plant you eat.
So you'll essentially be.
So you technically need like some 130 milligrams of carbohydrates a day to survive, survive and all that, right? And that literally any plant you eat, right, is going to have starch and sugars. That's just the way it is, right? Even the ones it may have very little, right? Even palak, it's going to have some. It's going to have some carbohydrates. A good chunk of them are things you can't digest. It'll be cellulose, etc. But it will still have digestible, because, by the way, the whole idea of leaves being green is that the chlorophyll is in chloroplast, and what's happening there is the production of sugars, actually, right? So it is the carbon dioxide that you breathe out, and then the water that the plant takes in, and then the sun's energy is used to basically break up oxygen into that, and those that freed up electrons is basically what drives a lot of those ATP to ADP changes and all of that. There's a huge chain of things that ultimately leads to glucose being made. Okay. So it is that, so you cannot actually be on a zero sugar. You can be on a zero added sugar diet. You can't be on a zero sugar diet, right? Literally every plant you eat is going to have sugars, right? All starch is just glucose molecules anyway. Yeah.
In fact, like the whole point of like every plant having sugar brings me to another type of sugar that a lot of us must have consumed. If not consumed, we definitely know about it, which is maple syrup. And maple syrup is one of, I think personally, I find it one of the most beautiful forms of sugar, in the sense the taste, the sheer taste that the syrup has, without doing anything, is absolutely magical to me. But there is some like interesting history with maple syrup as well, where maple syrup was like first, obviously, like it had been tapped by the North American natives for centuries, for a long time, way before the early colonizers like even came to the American continent or whatever. But once they did show up on the American continent, the North American continent, the colonizers were very readily accepted by the natives, and they showed them their ways. There was very little resistance, is what history says. And these guys, they showed the colonists how to tap maple syrup from trees, from maple trees. But the colonists, they were not as interested in maple syrup back then as they were. By the way, maple syrup now is like some $1,800 a gallon or something, which is extremely expensive. Like proper, true, pure maple syrup.
Yes. The difference between Canada and the USA is that the USA has a strategic petroleum reserve. Canada actually has a strategic maple syrup
like
reserve.
A Fort Knox of...
Yeah, I'm not kidding, right? In that they do that, yeah. So they do that so that they keep the price of maple syrup high. It's a complete cartel.
Like that's very Canadian if you think about it.
Yes.
Not just because...
Yes. There's a fantastic documentary about that involved even things like murders and all that.
But I bet they apologize.
Hilarious in the context of Canada. Yes.
The early European settlers, they were not interested in maple syrup. They were interested in the white gold, which is cane sugar that they were getting as exports out of the West Indian plantations and stuff.
And one, a very rather obvious answer to why that cane sugar was extraordinarily cheap. Because they didn't have to pay the people who actually grew it, because
and that's
because they just enslaved
the dark history of sugar,
essentially.
Which I don't, which I mean, it's such a massive topic that there's no way we can cover even like hundredths of it in like an hour of like
not even a fraction.
So these early settlers, they were to basically rival this white cane sugar. They basically started crystallizing maple, like started purifying and crystallizing maple syrup into what was called the maple sugar, which was also white in color and far superior in taste than your usual white sugar, which basically tastes like nothing but sweetness. This maple sugar played a huge role after the whole American War of Freedom and the revolution and everything, when like slavery started to become outlawed, like starting 1800s, slavery started to like, they finally figured out, imprisoning people, that owning them outright, making them work while still torturing them may not be a great idea. That's when they realized in 1800s, and they started outlawing everything.
So the funny thing is, it's not like they suddenly grew a moral fiber and said, "Oh no, slavery is wrong," and so on. It just became more profitable to take the moral stance because of the invention of the steam engine by the 1800s, which allowed you to do what slaves could do, at least in the factories, and cut a significant amount of your costs, right? Again, by the way, still the cutting bit, that is still human, right? And by the way, for those of you who've never seen a sugarcane plant in the wild, it has some of the sharpest leaves you can imagine. And it can literally slice your arm off. And it's like that's as sharp as a machete, right? So they actually have to wear a lot of protective gear. Of course, slaves, they were not given any protective gear and so on. But I think, as they say, that it's that when 100 horsepower began to look more economically viable than 100 slaves, that is when people said, maybe now posturing as we are against slavery is a good thing, which is why the British were the first to ban slavery, because they now had the steam engine. And there was another interesting, a couple of interesting side questions before we would forget that, right? One is that one guy is asking, Baulu Praveen asked, why diabetic patients shouldn't eat sugar? Why is it considered bad for the body? And like the simplest five explanation that I can give you is the fact that sugars are the simplest food we can eat. So everything that you eat, all the carbohydrates you eat, is ultimately broken down to glucose. And glucose is the energy currency of the body, right? So that's what gets into your blood from the small intestine, and every cell needs it. But for the cell to actually use glucose, so sort of think of it like, the cell doesn't let just things inside. So somebody has to have the key. Like it's like when you have to go open a locker in a bank, bank manager will have a key, you will have a key, that's so you can get into your locker, right? So same thing. And that added key is provided by this molecule called insulin. Right. So that's how your cells actually absorb the sugar and so on. So every time you eat lot of sugar in your blood, so the pancreas will generate insulin so that you can now absorb the sugar, right? What happens is that if you end up eating too much sugar and your blood sugar is always high, over time, you build what's called insulin resistance, meaning that insulin doesn't really work well. And at that point, you become sort of pre-diabetic, and eventually it gets to the point where you can't produce insulin, so you'll need to take insulin. Because sugar that just lies around in the blood, not a good idea. So it's going to cause a lot of damage to cells in your body if it cannot be absorbed. So that's the reason why diabetics cannot eat sugar. And by sugar, it's all sugar. It's jaggery, it's honey, it's fruits, it's every form of sugar. Yes, the other question is, onions are rich in sugar and widely available. Why isn't onion wine not popular? Great point, except that onions are really not that high in sugars, right? So compared to sugarcane or grapes or anything else, sugarcane is like 10% sucrose, right? Which by the way is insane amount of sucrose, right? And potatoes are again like mostly starch.
Right.
So you need something that's like starchy. So onions are almost 90% water for all I know, right? So it's mostly water. So there's like very little.
I mean, given like unlimited resources and stuff, you can ideally take any plant and make sugar out of it by like just like juicing it and like reducing all the water down and just making sugar from it. But it's just not efficient enough to make like even for maple syrup itself, like you have to boil like 7 liters of maple syrup to make like some 2 liters of maple sap to make 2 liters of maple syrup and stuff like that. So if you were to make sugar with onion, I'm guessing you'd have to like burn so much fuel to like just like turn that onion juice into
Yes, the entire district will be crying, while they do
and
that.
that wouldn't be because of the allium compounds.
Yes, exactly. So for those of you who are actually interested in the darker history of sugar that Pranav was speaking about, there's a fantastic book called Sweetness and Power by Sidney Mintz. Mintz. Okay, so I will anyway put that in the captions later. It's a fantastic book about the dark history of sugar. There's actually many books, but this is really
right. Just to sum it.
Sorry, all right, somebody's asking.
Sum it up, like,
go ahead.
The dark history of sugar. Just to sum it up, like all the slave trade that happened, all the capitalism that is happening, it all derives basically from sugar, from the pursuit of sugar, and that's what the entire story is about. Like that's the dark history of sugar.
Literally, yeah. I think it is. Sugar essentially was the driving force behind the transatlantic slavery. That was pretty much the primary thing. Right? Additionally, later it became
main
cotton
thing was
and tobacco,
sugar,
but sugar is right. Brazil and the US, right? I mean, the slavery was primarily
even like the West
was largely about
Western,
sugar, right?
African coast entirely.
Yeah, Western African coast, right? Yes, and then it is the money from sugar that also drove a lot of investment into industrial automation and essentially ultimately ended up with things like the steam engine and so on, which then ultimately managed to get rid of slavery in that sense, right? And then obviously that became the sort of base for the modern day capitalist industrial world of the early 20th century, right? So sugar is literally behind every single one of these things, right? So it's quite a fascinating, you don't realize. So there was this, somebody's asking if sugar is better than jaggery for consumption. As I've said in my video, there's really no difference. Both should be consumed in moderation. By all means, I think if you find jaggery tastier from a flavor standpoint, by all means, right? So people like the flavor of jaggery in many dishes, many Indian dishes, it works well and so on. But if you're baking, for example, jaggery is not a great sugar to bake with. I mean, it actively hampers with the rest of the things that give your baked good that structural rigor. So please don't ask bakers to bake with jaggery. They really don't like it. And they will thank you if you, at the end of the day, you should be consuming a lot less of those sweet baked goods, right? Rather than worry about whether it's jaggery or sugar, right? And the other point is that, I know again controversial, but jaggery with milk isn't good as per Ayurveda. Again, so there's also a practical element to it, right? So the jaggery that you likely to have gotten 2,000 years ago is not likely to have been treated with calcium hydroxide, sodium dithionate, and these sorts of things to bleach their color and things like that, right? And so that like super unprocessed jaggery is pretty acidic, and when you add acids to milk, it curdles milk. And so in many cases there are practical reasons why you would think about why you would not do something, but again, frame it in the past, right? Modern day, well-treated jaggery, etc., is not going to curdle your milk. And so if you want to add this to your tea, by all means do it, right? But I tend to prefer regular white sugar so it doesn't interfere with the flavor of tea.
And there are so many traditional sweets itself that use jaggery and milk together to make the sweet that is usually consumed for religious festivals and stuff like that. So it's a bit of a I mean, on one hand, like you can use milk and jaggery while making sweets for traditional festivals, but on the other hand, just consuming milk and jaggery is not good according to ancient wisdom. So again, like you have to figure out like which side works for you.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And also what changed between the 2,000 years that might perhaps not make the rule still.
I think someone was asking about artificial sweeteners, but I have like.
So that again that's an entirely sort of so to understand sweetness, right? You have to understand how sweetness is perceived, right? So basically, the way we perceive taste is these papillae, which are these taste buds on your tongue. There are like, we know 5 kinds. We believe there may be a few other kinds as well, but the ones that detect sugars, right, is essentially what we sense is sweetness, right? And so these are basically these protein-based 3-dimensional shapes into which molecules can fit, right? And different molecules fit in varying ways, right? So you can have different degrees of sweetness. Like so fructose from fruits is the sweetest, right? And then followed by sucrose, which is a combination of one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose, which is what you get in like your sugarcane and so on, white sugar or jaggery and so on. That is what you that is used as the base for saying that that's like a taste sweetness of 100, right? And then fructose is actually much sweeter than that. And then just regular glucose, which is the basic energy currency of the body is like it's about 60% or 70% as sweet as this and so on. And lactose is not very sweet at all, which is lactose is the sugar found in milk. Milk doesn't taste sweet as much directly because lactose by itself doesn't fit very well and so on. So ultimately, the whole idea of sweetness has always been about trying to find molecules that kind of fit into whose structure actually fits into the sweetness taste buds, right? And over the last like 100 years or so, we've sort of discovered several, right? So a couple of them have like very interesting sort of origins. Like for example, a coal tar residue. One chemist with very, very poor chemistry lab, practices, right, was generally working with coal tar and all these dangerous chemicals, and then ended up, I think, licking his hand, which again, not a safe thing to do. And he said, it's like, this is like super insanely sweet. And that's how they synthesized saccharin, which was one of the first. But saccharin since then has been found to have like a lot of bad effects on rats and so on. So it's not as widely used, but it is still reasonably used. So that's saccharin and so on, right? And then you have aspartame, which again also comes from a failed chemistry experiment, and that guy was like generally happened to sort of lick his hands, and it turned out to be sweet, and then so they started using that. And then sucralose, which again is very heat resistant, so you can actually use it in baking as well. Many of these other things actually break down at high temperature. So sugar-free desserts, you do need to use things like say sucralose and so on. So, but the other really interesting story is the fact that there is a connection between what you taste on your tongue and then essentially at that point you are telling the brain and to also notify the gut and say expect calories, bonanza is coming, right? Money is coming, right? and so the gut is like flexing its muscles and waiting, and then you eat one of these sugar-free substitutes, like and there are a bunch that come from like plant-based sources like monk fruit or stevia, which and so on. So those are also sort of sweeteners that are basically, they taste sweet here. They've tricked your tongue, but they get to the gut, the intestine is like, come on, I got cheated, so I can't really get any calories out of this. And then it'll tell the brain that I need sugar, right? And so the brain will then amp up your sugar cravings. And so, which is why longer term studies of people consuming sugar substitutes for a longer period of time end up not showing any serious weight loss. Because over time, they get short-term gains, and then they gain it all back on the long run because they keep getting cravings. And unconsciously, they keep eating more. So in that sense, so this is often the untold effects of some of these sugar substitutes.
No, and since you spoke about saccharin and sucralose, there's like super interesting, like for saccharin, as you said, that this was like back in 1879 when that one Russian dude called Konstantin Polberg, basically he was like researching about coal tar products and stuff like that. And as you said, like he had to rush for a supper, and basically he just like forgot to wash his hands. And when he was eating his food at the supper, he tasted his fingers, and he was like, "God damn, this is like super sweet." And then he went on and like tasted everything. But I think the more interesting story here is about sucralose. So sucralose, saccharin is pretty old. Saccharin is like 1876, and I think it is the first artificial sweetener that was discovered and then
the first artificial sweetener.
But sucralose, which is again like an artificial sweetener, is pretty recent. It's 1976. And 1976, there's this global food ingredients company called Tate and Lyle. So Tate and Lyle were working with these two researchers, one by the name of Leslie Howe and the other by the name of Shashikant Fadnis. So Shashikant Fadnas was a humble Maharashtrian dude working at Queen Elizabeth College in London along with Leslie Howe, and they were researching different uses of sucrose and its derivatives when they were like working with Tate and Lyle. And while they were tinkering around in their little laboratory, Howe basically asked Fadnas to test one of the chlorinated sugar compounds that they had. And now Marathi people, I am a Marathi guy, and Marathi people have this penchant for commonly elongating or shortening syllables at the wrong places. Like, for example, if they want to say pen, they'll say pain. Yeah, they'll say pain. Or if they want to say something like toothpaste, where the syllable is elongated, they'll say toothpaste. So they have a penchant for just shortening or elongating the syllables at the wrong places. So when Leslie Howe told Fadnas, our Marathi guy, to test one of the chlorinated sugar compounds, what our guy Fadnas heard is taste it, and not test it. So he basically tested it, and then he found tasted it, and he found it exceptionally sweet, and thus sucralose was discovered. Now I don't know if this story is completely true. It's there on like a lot of you'll see a lot of scientific communities telling the story as anecdote. So it's very likely true. But as a Marathi dude myself, I have absolutely no difficulty in believing that this is true, and Fadnas actually tasted it instead of testing it.
Yeah, and it's it is, and also it's quite unlikely that a modern day chemist is actually going to, unless otherwise randomly just taste stuff, right? All right. So, which kind of one interesting fun fact, about we spoke about taste buds, sweet taste buds. Which common animals don't have sweet taste buds at all?
Oh, I have no idea.
Can't detect sugar.
Oh wow.
Cats. Cats can't taste sugar.
That is.
So because again, it probably has to do with their evolution of like strictly being carnivores. So they literally no carbs in their diet.
Are these like all types of cats, or is this just like a domesticated tabby?
So that's what I'm saying. Wow. So it's all cats. So your lions and tigers and the entire Felidae family
that is super interesting.
Yeah. So that's quite was quite an interesting and so it's one of the other there was a question that someone kind of spoke about fructose and whether diabetics can eat fructose or not. Again, guys, neither of us are doctors, right? So you should not take medical advice from here. But glucose and fructose, right? One thing you should know is that glucose is the energy currency of the body, and fructose largely, the current evidence is that it largely gets metabolized into fat. It very rapidly gets metabolized into fat and so on. So we're still not entirely sure how much of what you eat in a fruit gives you instant energy, that how much of that is actually converted to glucose. Yes, there is a pathway, but they now increasingly believe that bulk of the fructose that you eat is going straight to fat. And essentially, apparently, may have evolved as a mechanism for ancient human beings to be able to gorge on fruits and put on weight for the winter, right? Because they may not get food during winter, they may have to hibernate and so on. And so the connection between eating fruits and putting on weight is now being explored, right? Again, all very, very early stage stuff. This is constantly changing science, and don't take this as gospel and so on. And so as for diet of what diabetics can or cannot eat, always speak to your doctor. So don't take advice from random dudes.
Someone else asked, how do we get rid of, I think Diane George, how do we get rid of sugar cravings? And is it true that you can reduce cravings if you quit sugar for a week? I think that's I'll address the second part. I think that's true with anything in general, that your first week is going to be like the hardest to quit anything, because your brain kind of releases dopamine every time you eat something, so that you end up eating more of it and start storing it as an energy reserve in a Armageddon situation or whatever. But that will happen with say cigarettes or alcohol as well, where the first couple of weeks will be the hardest, and then it will start progressively getting easier as your brain adjusts to the fact that you're not getting a daily dosage of your happy chemical or whatever. So I think it's true in that sense.
No, it's right. So our bodies are super adaptive, by the way. People forget how adaptive our metabolism is, right? So no matter what you throw at it, it'll adapt itself to figure out what can I get most from this, right? So if you suddenly become a carnivorous diet, it'll figure it out. If you suddenly become a vegan diet, it'll figure it out, right? Problems only come when you kind of miss some of the critical micronutrients
Right.
and the larger balance, right? For the most part, it can adjust to a wide range of things. And particularly, one of the best things it adjusts to is generally eating less food. So all it does is it slows your heart rate down, it slows your metabolism down, it tries to retain more of your fat, and then eventually it will start burning your fat. Which is really why weight loss is like so goddamn hard, because our evolution is so beautifully fine-tuned metabolism that it does not want you to lose fat. Because I think 40, 50,000 years ago, losing fat in your body
Right.
is a death sentence. Because once you get to winter and you don't get food, you'll be the first to die, right? But in the modern day world, the problem is that we're surrounded by food, we're surrounded by sugars, we're surrounded by the stuff, none of which was available back then, right? So we're sort of, unfortunately, Paleolithic bodies dealing with 22nd century, 21st century food, right? Which is the food environment is where the problem is. Okay, 5:20. So I think we should now get to our
Cringy jokes part.
Joke segment. Any other questions we missed? Anyway, so I'm going to go through 6 progressively cringy jokes, right? We'll start with a very simple one. We'll do 6 and I'll start with the simplest one. You've heard of glucose, fructose, maltose, and all of that. What is the saddest sugar?
I don't know. Morose.
Morose. All right. Okay. So that is a very lightweight, simple one. All right. So number 2, right? Now that we warmed up, what is somebody who can eat sugar with both hands? What do they call it?
Hey.
You got it. That was an easy one. That was an easy setup, right?
You
Yeah.
just said
Ambidextrose.
glucose and stuff in the last joke. Yeah. So I was like,
Maltose, glucose, you're already there. Yeah. So the O's is already there. Yes. Yes. So again, small sort of nerdy fun fact. Anything ending in O's is sugar.
Right.
Anything ending in ASE,
Right.
ACE is an enzyme.
So
one
can also say.
Yeah. So amylase digests amylose, and then protease digests proteins, and then
Right.
lipase
So one can
digests,
also say that
fats.
if like eating sugar is not just your बाएं हाथ का खेल but also your दाएं हाथ का खेल, then you're ambidextrous.
Yeah, ambidextrose. All right. Okay. Number 3. If you threw sugar at someone and hurt them, it's not a crime. Why?
I don't know. It's not.
It's not assault.
Okay. I see. This joke connects like
All right,
the last
so-
session.
so all right, so-
together with-
Yeah, exactly. It's connecting the sugar and salt, right? So that's number 3. Now that we warmed up, we'll get to the more interesting ones. In places like Colombia and Mexico and so on, if you have like the carbonated beverages there, you'll find that they use cane sugar. They don't use high fructose corn syrup, which is what is used in the United States, right? And so therefore, what are those carbonated beverages called?
I really want to work this out, but I'll let you go. I'll let you take this. Wow. Okay.
Cocaine.
Yeah, that was right there. Yeah, that was right there. Damn.
Cocaine, right? Yeah. Yes. That was right there. So there. So that's number 4 and number 5. All right. Okay. Now we get to slightly more interesting levels, right? So this opera singer who took a sugar pill before every performance. What was his name?
I'm thinking something to do with. No, I can't think. I can't make this out.
Placebo Domingo.
Highbrow. Super. I see why that's a level 5.
Because super highbrow, right?
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So because a sugar pill is a placebo, right? So,
Got it.
so Placebo Domingo. For those who didn't
Don't
get it,
explain-
the Placido Domingo was a famous.
For those who didn't get it, like that's your
All right.
loss.
Yeah, no. And the last one, right? So there's this guy whose business partner cheats on him, swindles all of his money, gets him falsely implicated in a tax case, and he's sort of thrown in jail, goes through a lot of lawsuits. He spends time in jail, and he comes back from jail after spending 10 brutal years in jail. Then he goes buy a sugarcane, and he beats his business partner. Why?
This has to be some incarcerated joke, right?
Yeah, because revenge is sweet. So
Right.
the elaborate setup had to be there, right? So that you can
Right,
maximize
obviously.
the cringe potential
Absolutely.
of the joke, if you will. Yes. All right. So that was a fun chat on sugar. I'm just trying to see if we missed any major questions. I wish they could just let us filter all of the joined and not stuff which let us just see if we missed anything. Yeah, we addressed the sugar, jaggery stuff. Yeah, somebody was asking about honey. Honey is also, unfortunately, just mostly sugar. Okay. And if you're getting some super rare forest honey where the bees get to collect from a ton of various flowers or very specific kinds of flowers and so on, yes, the honey may contain some antioxidants that may be good for you. But for you to get benefits out of those antioxidants, you would have to consume a lot of honey. And that's just a lot of sugar. And so therefore, be aware of that. And the moment if you are heating that honey, you're going to destroy all of those antioxidants anyway. So at that point, it's just
also,
sugar.
tying
right?
up those two questions that we had earlier, where someone asked if onions have sugar, why don't we make sugar from onions? And also the root vegetables having a higher amount of sugar. Majority of the sugar that you get in US is made from a root vegetable, actually, something from the beet family, which is the sugar beet. And basically the process is just the same. They crush the sugar beet, extract juice, reduce it down, purify it, and make sugar crystals from it. So vegetables that can be used to make sugars are used to make sugars. So if there is a vegetable that which has a lot of sugar that's probably not being used, it's for a good reason, most probably.
Yeah, probably just has starch, which unless you use enzymes. Somebody was asking, when you're making a DIY malted drink, sprouting wheat and adding amylase enzyme, and doing it right to unlock the sugar in the grains. Yes, so that's what amylase does. Amylase breaks starch into glucose. So that's exactly what's happening.
Some amount of amylase in our saliva as well, and digestion starts right when we are chewing food.
And actually, if you take French fries and just chew it in your mouth for a few minutes, it will eventually taste sweet. So normally it doesn't, because we don't let it spend enough time. So you quickly swallow it. So the bulk of the rest of the conversion to glucose happens in the small intestine. Right? Nothing happens in the stomach. Stomach is just basically this giant acid bath. That's it. And then everything else goes down to the stomach just is an acid bath to kill bacteria. And then after that, and the acids might sort of break down proteins a little bit and so on, but all the rest of the enzymes
Someone
actually
was asking no jokes on brown sugar, and I guess all of you watching are the brown sugars, and we don't make jokes on our audience. So,
so yeah, and also I'm also wondering. I think in the probably I guess. Nowadays, it's not so much of a scare, but there was a point of time in India where there was this gentle scare that everybody was going to become a drug addict, and the scary drug of that was on Doordarshan all the time was brown sugar, right? Which I think is it's
a slang.
Is it heroin?
I forget which one, but particularly. Right.
Yeah. Hashisha and one of those things. All right. If you guys have any more questions, if not, I think we will close this. So what do you want to do next week?
Do you guys have suggestions what we should do next week? I think, we had a bunch of topics that we had discussed itself. And one of the topics was, did we discuss fats? Since going with this, the salt, acid, fats thing.
Yes.
Or we can do acids.
Yeah. So we can do. Yes,
not that acid.
Yes. Not that acid, but yes.
Not that acid.
Yes. No, yes. Yeah, actually, it's quite interesting how I don't know if you've Martin Sheldrake's book on fungi, right? Astonishing book, huh? It's sort of about how, for those of you watching Last of Us or who have played the game Last of Us and so on, literally every the most crazy mind-altering drugs are synthesized by fungi. So, right? So if at all there's, ever going to be this sort of a fungal epidemic where it doesn't make you sick and die, but literally it takes control of your mind, it's going to be a fungi, right? So, yeah. So somebody wants to do an episode on baking soda. Of course, we should do that. Yeah. So I think we should. But before we do that, we should design a superhero cape which is baking soda themed, right? It should be the head should be like the bicarbonate shape.
Your baking soda fanboys will be showing.
And so on. And then,
where are the comments? I can't see. Yes. If you can see the ones where people are suggesting topics, I can't see any of them.
Yeah. So there's fats. Refined cold pressed oils. So we could do fats, I guess, right? But again, I think guys, don't treat this as, while we might occasionally get into some practical advice and all that. The idea here is to have fun, right? And sort of think about history and random, completely absurdist stories and so on. Right? Somebody's asking, is sugar addictive? Yes, it is. It is. So increasingly there is evidence that the neurological pathways related to sugar addiction are no different from addiction to any other kind of actual serious drug and so on, but at a milder level, obviously, right? And more sustained. and the damage to your body is actually obviously on the longer run, right? Whereas those harder drugs will like damage you in a very short in a short term, right? So yes, so okay, baking soda no, salt intake no. I think we've already done salt. Can you? Oh, okay, so I think somebody suggested food labels. You know what we should do? We should do one episode where we sort of dissect some of the most common food labels. But we'll have to do it in a way that I'm not necessarily interested in calling out a specific brand and things like that. Right? It should really should just be the label, right? And then we sort of try and decode how it's actually quite fascinating when it comes to sugar. The number of creative ways in which companies will hide added sugars, right? Oh yeah, agave syrup, date syrup. My favorite is in India is date syrup. It's just fructose mostly. Instead of high fructose corn syrup, you can use date syrup. But yeah, so the other one is maltodextrin, which is actually quite wicked because it actually doesn't taste sweet. But remember how I said your gut can also signal the fact that something is sweet. So maltodextrin, your intestine will be very happy and give you say, hey, I need more of this, right? And but you won't taste it sweet at all. So it's often used to make savory snacks more addictive, right? Where you can't add sugar. You add maltodextrin, it won't taste sweet, right? So people will be like, oh, this is like spicy kurkure, whatever it is, right? And then you then your gut will be like, oh wow, this has sugar, give me some more, right? And so maltodextrin, it's also used to improve.
You'll see that a lot in like baking, as well as like you'll see it in a lot of seasoning mixes. Because again, like for that addictive property, just the same as like monosodium glutamate, which most seasoning packets will have.
Somebody wants to do one on millets also.
Millets,
some international.
I had a very interesting talk with Shailendra from Triple O.
Yes, basically millets, also known as how to eat carbohydrates that taste like cardboard, but roughly give you the same glycemic as everything else. So that is, I know I'm being cruel, but yes, but good to eat a range of grains. To be honest. On that note, I think we should call it a day. We will post this video, and we will also post it on YouTube once we add all of the fun visuals related to all the stories that we spoke about here at some point in time next week.
This was great. Thank you so much, and see you guys in 15 days.
Super fun. Bye bye. See you in 2 weeks.